Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in to our virtual symposium. The title is In Their Own Voices, Researcher and Participant Experiences of Vulnerability and Agency in Global Health Research. I'm Maureen Kelley, and I'll be chairing the symposium. I'm a bioethicist working in women's and children's health at the Epoch Center and Wellcome Center for Ethics and Humanities at the University of Oxford. This symposium and the project discussed were made possible by generous support from the Wellcome Chest. In this session, we'll share qualitative findings from the REACH study, a longitudinal empirical ethics project on the ethics of research with populations considered vulnerable. This was a collaborative study co-led with my colleagues Vicky Marsh, Sassi Molyneux, Mike Parker, Paek-Young Chea, and Janet Seeley. The project embedded empirical ethics research within prospective clinical studies involving pregnant women, young people, and children in low-income rural and border settings in South Africa, Kenya, and the Thai-Myanmar border. Our aim was to address key empirical gaps in our understanding of ethics and vulnerability in global health research. The first four of us speaking in this session are presenting on behalf of our terrific REACH team, pictured here on a lovely hot day in Bangkok, pre-lockdown. Many hours have gone into the data collection and analyses discussed in the presentations. We're very grateful for everyone's efforts and insights. This was absolutely a team effort. We would also like to acknowledge the collaborating clinical scientists at our 3 study sites who have kindly granted access to their work and study teams to members of our bioethics and social science team for nearly 4 years. Without their partnership, openness, intellectual generosity, and collaborative spirit, this project would not have been possible. In the REACH study, we set out to investigate the ethical challenges surrounding vulnerability and related moral considerations, such as agency, resilience, and empowerment in women's and children's health research in low-resource settings. As we engage researchers and communities, we also became really interested in the important role research can play in building the evidence base to address health and social vulnerabilities, and to then advocate for change. The first 3 speakers in the symposium will present findings from 3 of our 6 qualitative case studies. The first presenter will be Scholar Zakayo from Kimry Wellcome Trust Research Program in Kilifi, Kenya. The second will be Dr. Busi Nkosi from RE in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. The third speaker will be Professor Paek-Young Chea, Head of Bioethics and Engagement for Mahidol Oxford Tropical Medicine Research Unit in Thailand. We're really delighted to offer a commentary from Professor Florencia Luna from CONICET in Buenos Aires, Argentina. We've asked Florencia to reflect on her own work on vulnerability, and particularly her layered model of vulnerability, and consider really what the implications are of some of the empirical findings from our case studies. To help put each of the presentations in context within the wider study, I'll share a brief overview of the study aims, design, and cross-site early findings. But first, I thought I'd give you a little bit about the starting point for our study. Vulnerability remains a really important concept in research ethics protection, but we think more work is needed to critically investigate its real-world applications. Our empirical research ethics project had its starting point in feminist models and critiques of vulnerability and agency, particularly those of Wendy Rogers, Katarina McKenzie, Susan Dodds, and Ruth Macklin. These included appeals to contextual, complex, or layered accounts of vulnerability, in particular Florencia Luna's account. These conceptual accounts and recent changes to research ethics guidance, for example in CIOMS in its most recent revision, and in several of the Nuffield Council reports, have encouraged greater focus on context and specificity about the sources and nature of vulnerabilities in research, and are at the same time mindful of overprotection. However, we think we still lack a critical empirical insight into sort of how vulnerability manifests in dilemmas in daily research on the ground, and potentially challenge some of these theoretical and policy shifts. While there have been a number of critics who've questioned the usefulness of vulnerability in research ethics guidance, We maintain that vulnerability remains central to global health and global health research in particular. When you think about how most of the priority setting around global health research tracks the global burden of disease, and you look at which countries bear the greatest burden of disease, these are the same countries where you have large populations of people living in really difficult circumstances due to poverty, experiencing complex biomedical, social, and structural vulnerabilities. So it's so important to understand the way in which those daily struggles, political, social, health struggles, environmental, interact with research and potentially exacerbate those existing vulnerabilities. It's also important to, of course, understand how the research and whether the research ameliorates some of those biomedical social vulnerabilities. Now, vulnerability in research generally refers to individuals, families, or groups of people who have an increased susceptibility to harms or maltreatment in the research context, either through a diminished capacity, for example, as we see with younger children, neonates, some psychiatric patients, or their circumstances in the case of prisoners, refugees, or those living in extreme poverty. And in these situations, or due to diminished capacity, those who are considered vulnerable are less able to safeguard their own interests as research participants, and the current mechanisms for safeguarding your interests are consent or refusal. There are a number of really important limitations to the current thinking and guidance around vulnerability and research, and these have been discussed in the literature. The first is that it continues to focus almost solely on the risks of enrollment and not the harms of exclusion. This comes up strongest in the debate around the inclusion and exclusion of pregnant women in research. Second, the determinations still continue to be all or nothing, taking this labeling or population-based approach to vulnerability. And as mentioned, it leads to unjust exclusion. You're either in the population or outside of the population. There's not a lot of gray area. And it's limited in two ways. It's both too narrow in that you're going to miss some people who are genuinely vulnerable who fall outside those categories. And it's too broad. You're going to pull in those who may very well have the capacity to participate in beneficial or potentially beneficial research. Third, it disregards the context and the context of vulnerability, the way in which somebody is vulnerable, the specific risks somebody is susceptible to, particularly the layered account that Florencia has talked about. There's not much room in the account to take those types of considerations into account in our obligations. And we think this really points to the need for more empirical work on this question. By the same token, it can be stigmatizing and paternalistic. Anytime you rely on generalizations about an entire population, this can exacerbate current thinking around, for example, young girls living with HIV as being vulnerable. And in fact, there's a reason why the word vulnerability was dropped from our study name, is because we were responding to concerns among some that while vulnerability is important and indeed real, the label was problematic and taken as insulting by some. The other thing that's really important and has shaped our study is that determinations of vulnerability continue to be ascribed to people and not owned and not described in people's own words. So the spirit of our project was really to go speak with participants, community members, and frontline researchers and find out what people's direct experiences of vulnerability are and how they talk about that against other important values. The most important of which was agency, resilience, other competing values having more to do with somebody's power despite being vulnerable in the research context. So we think that that's a missing aspect of the current thinking around vulnerability. And last, there's been very little attention in how research research ought to address structural sources of vulnerability in or through research. So we were interested in highlighting what those structural vulnerabilities are and how researchers in the field try to engage them or don't engage them. We were really interested in that. Right now, the thinking sort of brackets structural vulnerability. It's not something that, it's something that's set outside of research, and we were interested to engage it more directly. Now I'd like to offer some details of the overall study design to help put the presentations in context. The REACH study aimed to take a 360-degree view of vulnerability and related values such as agency and resilience in research in low resource settings. And we focused on, for the most part, maternal, newborn, child health studies, just to manage the scope a bit, and also because we were really interested in the function of gender in vulnerability in research. So the first aim tracks the first perspective, which is to really understand the perspective of participants in research, their families, and key people in the communities. The second then was to understand the perspective of researchers and research teams. And again, there we were interested in all levels and roles in a research project. So we not only interviewed researchers at different levels, from leadership to the front lines, but we spoke to and conducted focus groups with community advisory boards and other key figures in the community that are involved in engaging in research priority setting. Last, we have a conceptual aim, and this work is just starting because we're just finishing our empirical work, but it was to reflect on the empirical data and reflect on current thinking around vulnerability. And I've mentioned the accounts that have influenced us from feminist bioethics. So, later this year, we'll be turning our attention to some of the implications of our empirical findings. And the idea will be to then think about the relationship between the two. What have we learned that requires a shift in thinking at the conceptual level, and vice versa? Where does conceptual thinking, where could it be sort of expanded and given more nuance based on some of our empirical findings? The other really important feature of the REACH study design was its longitudinal structure. So we aimed to engage research teams as close to the outset of their study as possible. This varied obviously across 6 case studies. In one case, we were involved before they had full funding, so we were involved in sort of last design adaptations, inclusion-exclusion discussions. In another case study, the South African case study, the PEPFAR Dreams, ended early. So we were able to sort of see what kinds of issues did a study aimed at a population of vulnerable adolescent girls, what happened when that study ended early. So across the case studies, we were interested in looking at the whole range of kind of key junctures in the life course of a research study and how vulnerability manifests, and broaden the perspective of our understanding of vulnerability in research, moving away from the sole focus on enrollment. We did look at enrollment, we did look at consent, but we were interested in this broader picture. This is a quick visual overview of the study design. Just to show, the first box is the heart of the study, which are these 6 qualitative case studies. And the presentations today will focus on this aspect of the study and these data. We're also conducting complementary qualitative interviews internationally to try to break out of our case studies, which in a number of ways were sort of idealized in order to make it possible to do the work that we wanted to do. We realized those were exceptional organizations that already had ethics and social science teams built in. So we're conducting additional interviews with over trying to complement that data and see how far it bears out in a wider population. Similarly, we're in the midst of designing an international survey to test out some of the key findings from the rich qualitative data and look at things like prevalence of some of the dilemmas that we are hearing from in our qualitative data, and see how those bear out in a much larger, more sort of quantitative picture. As I said, the qualitative case studies were really at the heart of the REACH study. So I'd like to say a little bit about their structure to save time for the presenter so they don't have to go into the detailed methods. So we had 3 sites, Kenya, Thailand, and South Africa. And in each of these, we followed 2 research teams. So we had 6 case studies. And we tried to vary the types of research that we were engaged in. Some were clinical RCTs, some were implementation studies at the evaluation phase following clinical trials. We had a range of populations. So we have some that were neonatal studies, some that were children, young children living with HIV, adolescent girls, some living with HIV, and migrant pregnant women. All took place in low resource settings, but there was quite a bit of variation on the background, political events, environmental disasters or events such as drought, strikes. There were all kinds of things that characterized each setting. So I'll let the speakers say more about that. We engaged these teams for 2 to 4 years. So again, depending on when the study started and when our project started, one is still ongoing and may go for 5 years. Our engagement included ethics discussions, reflections, what would characterize embedded empirical ethics research, and observations. So this is the study design template that we applied to all of the embedded ethics, research ethics case studies, and wanted to share this in case others are interested in adopting this approach in your own work. It's meant to be flexible. So what each of the case studies had in common was this combination, this embeddedness of a research ethics social science team at the site, from that site. So it wasn't somebody from the UK going there. These were local researchers. And they got to know the research teams. They sat in on consultations, team meetings, again, at various times during the research project. And also interviewed and spoke to participants in some cases over time. As you'll hear from Scholar, they followed households and spoke to everyone in the household over a number of encounters, resulting in really, really rich, ongoing, iterative conversations with research participants, in this case, the parents, with children who were participants in the study. So there was some variation depending on the structure of the linked study, but for the most part, all had this kind of feedback mechanism. And the other thing I wanted to say was that we felt we had an ethical obligation to respond to the ethical issues and challenges as they came up and to help the research teams. So the other output that we have, will have from REACH, are a series of tools that we use to help with issues around ancillary care decisions, for example, ethics reflections. Some of the teams kept ethics diaries. The frontline researchers kept ethics diaries about issues that came up and then fed them into group discussions. So we will also have a lot of practical tools coming out of the project to share with people in a few months' time. In addition to the case studies, we've also included some participatory visual work. So again, please keep an eye on our website, and we'll be sharing some of these videos with CAB members in the next few months. The idea with engaging CAB members was we saw them as a bridge between the community and the experience of researchers. As part of the participatory visual work, we were really lucky to have someone on the team who's a very talented photographer and wonderful field researcher, and so has a great connection with the women in the community. And this is Supak Nostan, who worked in our MESOT SMRU case study. And she has created a really beautiful series, which again we'll link on our website soon. And showing day-to-day life journeys into the research clinic. This picture here was during rainy season, obviously, and showed these moms trying to make their way into the clinic for their antenatal visits. So I encourage you to keep an eye on our website to see some of Supak's really striking work. And again, the idea here was to complement more traditional data collection methods and try to find ways outside of the interview and the focus group to let people show or share their stories in their own words, or in this case, in pictures. Each of our speakers will say much more about the study sites. I just wanted to introduce them very briefly. The first site was a Kimmery Wellcome Trust research program in Kilifi, which is coastal Kenya region. And they've been conducting research since 1989. It's a large research program in a very rural area with high levels of poverty. And I'll let scholars say much more about the features of Kimmery and the population that we were engaged with in Kilifi. Our second site was in Somkhele in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. And again, Busi will speak to some of the details of the demographics of the region. But this was a really important site in that we were partnered with ARI, which has a long history of conducting population health research and now clinical and bench research, primarily around HIV and TB, but increasingly in other disease areas. And I'll let Busi speak to some of the interesting features of the region. Our third international site was Thailand, and within the country we had two case study sites, Mae Sot and Chiang Rai. Both are characterized by being border towns, and most of the research on the border addresses endemic diseases, and particularly infectious diseases among migrant populations. So in addition to there being established research programs with social science capacity and ethics capacity, these were both really important and interesting regions to look at complex vulnerability. So I'll let Pei Kyung say more about the details. This is a quick snapshot of our current cross-site recruitment, which is still ongoing. Again, as I mentioned, we have rich sources of data from researchers, participants in the Kimmery case, households, CAB members, ethics committee members, and a few key policy stakeholders at each of the sites, with close to a total of 300 interviews or group discussions. Before turning over to our speakers, I wanted to highlight a few preliminary cross-site findings and themes, ideas that have echoed across the data in these very diverse sites. Because we followed research teams longitudinally, we have a lot of really interesting data around familiar topics in research ethics, so I think we'll be providing a really rich empirical set of ideas to current debates, for example, around priority setting, exclusion, and the impact of exclusion on historically vulnerable populations. We have a lot of interesting findings around challenges in consent and voluntary participation. I think you'll find in Pei Kyung's presentation, for example, there's some really interesting issues that came up there. Research as a humanitarian intervention has been a kind of ongoing debate on our team across the sites. How far should research go to respond to complex economic and biomedical social needs of participants in low resource settings? We've had a really strong cross-site theme on moral distress, in particular the moral distress of frontline researchers. So we'll be writing a few individual papers just on that topic. And another sort of cross-cutting finding in the data surrounds trust and expectations. What do the communities expect research to do and provide? And what's the potential mismatch between expectation and what research actually offers in the way of benefit? So these are just some of the things that I think you'll learn more about in the presentations. So what have we learned so far in our study across the sites? The first finding that's really interesting is that current research ethics guidance is not very good at addressing vulnerabilities of daily living and how these intersect with research, and in particular structural sources of vulnerability. And the second is that we've confirmed that population-based accounts of vulnerability are not particularly helpful. They miss people who are vulnerable and in a, quote, normal population, adult men, for example, and they miss targeted contextual reasons why somebody might be vulnerable. So again, too broad, too specific conundrum very much bears out in our data. Third is the idea of constrained agency, right? Agency despite being highly vulnerable or at risk. We have found to be really pronounced in the data and a really important idea potentially for thinking about improving consent, fair benefits, and how to respectfully engage those who might otherwise be quite vulnerable in some ways, but not in other ways. Fourth, we found that there are many challenges around the limits of duty of care or ancillary care, and a substantial burden of ancillary care decision-making and response falls on frontline researchers. And this is linked to the fifth finding, which is this issue of moral distress, and it points to a broader theme across our data, which is that the importance of the emotions in research and research ethics and figuring out what your obligations are and how you ought to respond was really, really pronounced in our findings. And last, we found that there's a significant gap in the post-ethics approval space for practical ethics support and for helping guide research as it's happening and with practical tools, with continued engagement and conversation. Another important output of the REACH study will be to figure out how best to model this richer, more layered account of vulnerability, but in particular structural vulnerability in the research context. So turning and reflecting again on Florencia's account, Wendy Rogers' account, and Katerina McKenzie, and thinking about, in light of the data, what does this model look like, and what are the implications for more conceptual thinking about our obligations in research around the nature of this more complex nature of vulnerability. So I hope that's given you more context to the overall study, and I now encourage you to click on the links to the symposium presentations and our commentator Florencia Luna to learn more about each of the case studies. For those of you interested, we'll be hosting an online chat and discussion in the next few weeks. Please email Kai Heath if you're interested and share your email address, and he will share the link. We very much hope to hear from you and would love to have a chance to have more of a discussion since we weren't able to meet you in person. Thanks so much for your interest in our project. In closing, we wanted to again thank the Wellcome Trust for their generous support of this project. And I personally wanted to thank our fabulous team. We really miss being there with you in person, but hope you enjoy the rest of the symposium. Thanks so much.